Hey, thank you everyone for having me. Give me one second while I set up my share screen here. Okay, are you able to see this slide? I guess I can't tell. I will count on. Okay, great, awesome. Thank you all so much for having me here. I have been really enjoying retroactively going back and listening to past Shy Hack Nights. I wish we were in person, of course, but I think it's great to be able to do this online as well. So I want to just quickly introduce myself. Right now I'm an architect. I run a practice called Future Firm. We describe ourselves as architects for change makers, which means we work with people who are making change in their own communities. And that's, you see right now a range of projects that we have on the board and that we've worked on. Some of you may have been to the Silver Room in Hyde Park. And I'm also making a shameless plug here for Bronzeville Winery, which will be opening in September and is an incredible project by Eric Williams and Cecilia Cuff, as well as a new bar at the Den Theater, which will also be opening this fall. So I'm in private practice, and in addition to that, I also teach at the University of Michigan, where I teach graduate students in the Master of Architecture program. And then I'm also going to be teaching an upcoming seminar this fall on some of the topics that I'll be going through tonight on the question of building code and social equity. So that's a little bit about who I am. I'm calling in tonight from Bridgeport. I live and work in a space that used to be called the Poor Man's Pub. So you can see behind me the walk-in freezer where the beer used to be kept. Just a quick outline about what I'm going to be presenting tonight. This idea of the Office of the Public Architect is some kind of advocacy work that I've been thinking about doing since probably 2017. And I want to kind of give you all the pitch for it and make a case for why I think this is something that should happen in Chicago, as well as all over the United States. That will be the majority of the presentation. And then I'm also going to give a short pitch for an idea of how this could work as a pilot, imagining that if you had asked me tonight how we could get this going tomorrow, I have some ideas. And then lastly, I hope you guys are excited. We're going to do a little bit of story time, and I'm going to read you a short kind of science fiction speculation about what it would be like to visit the Office of the Public Architect if we were able to fast forward in time to go there in person. So I want to start here. During the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago at an International Congress of Lawyers, Clara Shortridge Foltz presented her idea of the public defender, an attorney provided by the state to represent those who cannot afford legal counsel. Foltz, who was the first woman admitted to the bar in California, had witnessed the crisis of poor defendants in the Western courts. In her address that she made here in Chicago to the Congress of Jurisprudence and Law Reform, called The Rights of Persons Accused, she shared her experience that defendants in poverty often found themselves without representation and in the quote-unquote savage state of defending themselves against well-funded and well-appointed public prosecutors. Foltz proposed that, quote, for every public prosecutor, there should be a public defender chosen in the same way and paid out of the same fund. Core to Foltz's argument for the public defender was the urgent need for balance. She argued, make the law a shield as well as a sword. Today, in major cities across the United States, the Department of Buildings is a uniquely edged sword without an attendant shield. In Chicago, the Department of Buildings was established in 1875, and it may be hard to recognize it as a prosecutorial institution, but that is how I see it. The Kafkaesque bureaucracy, for any of those of you who have ever been to the Department of Buildings, know that it comprises endless beige and wood veneer desks, tangled phone trees, chimerical regulations, and a legion of largely anonymous building inspectors, one of whom you can see here in this image. Yet in 2018, and certainly in years since, the Chicago Department of Buildings has issued over 103,000 building violations, notices of non-compliance with the city's municipal and building codes, which range from crumbling exterior walls to hazardous porch constructions. If you look at all the quantity of building violations that have been issued since 2006, more building violations have been issued than there are buildings in Chicago. Some of the most frequently issued violations require only small acts of repair, and you can do them yourself, such as installing a missing smoke detector or removing debris piled in a side yard. However, more substantial common violations require the work of a licensed architect to resolve, such as illegal attic and basement conversions to residential units, porch and rear deck construction, and structural damage in basement foundations or exterior walls. All construction in the city, except for small quote unquote repair and replace improvements, require drawings that are sealed with the stamp of a licensed architect. While the city employs inspectors to enforce codes, it does not provide architectural services required for legal absolution. These are a series of drawings that I made with my partner when we were trying to imagine how to envision the city through the eyes of a building inspector. So each of them represents a group of some of the top 20 most frequently issued building violations. So in this image on the left, you can see issues about egressing and exiting, such as replacing members from exterior stair system, or installing or maintaining approved smoke detectors. Or on the right, issues like replacing broken, missing, or defective window panes, or repairing or replacing doors. Additionally, you can see here on the left, there are frequent violations around exterior walls, pyramid maintenance, as well as interior walls and ceilings. And what we're calling on the right, house of compliance, are questions about, for example, posting the name, address, and telephone of the owner, filing a building registration, or as I previously mentioned, the required need to submit plans prepared, signed, and sealed by a licensed architect. So this project asks, if you are entitled to a public defender when accused of committing a crime, then should you have the right to a public architect when issued a building violation? I think we should consider a revision of Clara Foltz's statement. For every public inspector, there should be a public architect chosen in the same way and paid out of the same fund. So I think that I just want to kind of flag that while the skyline of the Chicago Loop is well known, the residential building stock in the city's neighborhoods is what I think defines its architectural character and represents the Chicago that I really love. There are the ubiquitous 100-year-old orangey brown brick 2 and 3 flats with multi-story bay windows and decorative cornices. There are the stately graystones with Indiana limestone and Gothic facades along the west side. The single-story workers' cottages from historic Pullman to Uptown with their odd little garages. And these are buildings that, in addition to comprising the majority of Chicago's building stock, are often most vulnerable to the negative impacts of building violations, which can extend beyond the initial fines and cost of repair. Unlike a speeding ticket, Chicago's building violations are rarely one-offs. So in 2015, the mean violations per building inspection was 8, but sometimes in a single visit, over 30 building violations were issued. If unaddressed building violations accumulate for whatever reasons, building owners find themselves in the buildings hearings division, colloquially called building court or housing court, an administrative and judicial process without all of the procedures of a criminal case. In housing court, the city prosecutes the owners of buildings that are deemed hazardous through a process called receivership, in which ownership is transferred to a third party to execute repairs, collect rent, or bill the owner, or in some cases, forfeiture to the city. Administrative hearings that lead ultimately to forfeiture can be triggered in multiple ways, including if any violations are immediately hazardous, if the cost for repairs exceeds the market value of the building or the owner does not have the funds to make the repairs, or if violations have not been addressed within 60 days. Unlike the fact that there are payment plans for parking tickets, there are no formal triage provisions for building violations. Repair plans submitted for permit to the city and subsequent inspections must show an entirely code compliant building, which often causes a sudden financial burden. The consequences of not doing so are also steep. If the city ultimately acquires the building through forfeiture, hazardous buildings can be slated for demolition. Chicago's city-owned land inventory, as I know folks from Chi-Hacknight know well, currently comprises over 19,000 vacant lots, and it continues to add to this list through hundreds of city-ordained demolitions per year, over 3,100 since 2008. As you can see on the right, the kind of heat map in plan is city-owned vacant land, and then you can also see the kind of attendant spikes of city-ordained building demolitions in the kind of vertical axis. An office of the public architect would intervene upstream from these known issues of vacancy in Chicago. The office would provide access to a small but legally mandated service at the moment when the constant and divergent pressures of market value, building maintenance, access to design services, and the unequal deployment of law converge. And I think this is a history that's known well, but I think it's important to kind of bring this up within the context of this call, which is that I believe it is impossible to separate the system of building violations in which the Office of the Public Architect seeks to intervene from the fraught history of Chicago's residential building stock, namely the history of contract selling and redlining. These two exploitive practices, among others, targeted African Americans and led directly to the conditions in which the Office of the Public Architect is badly needed today. The existence of regions in Chicago where the building stock is in worse condition than others, and where homeowners have less access to resources to repair or renovate, including the legal requirement to hire an architect through no fault of their own. Starting in the aftermath of the Great Depression, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, graded neighborhoods through redlining maps, which caused lenders to refuse Federal Housing Administration, FHA mortgages to buyers in neighborhoods inhabited by African Americans. In the 1950s and 60s, speculators took advantage of the Second Great Migration of folks who dreamed of owning property but were unable to secure the same federally backed credit that fueled white home buying during the same period. Real estate speculators instead sold houses to Black families at double and triple the market value, quote unquote, on contract, flipping a $3,000 home into a $12,000 sale in many cases. In this agreement, contract sellers remained as owners, withholding deeds on the condition that buyers paid large monthly mortgage payments on time with higher than market interest rates. Just one missed payment gave the owner the right to evict the buyer, resulting in the loss of their entire investment, and then to restart the process again with another family at the same property, earning the same profit on the same house again and again. If we overlay a map showing the density of building violations, which you see in those circles of varying size there, with the FHA redlining maps of Chicago from the post-war period, we can see the relationship of contract selling and the unequal access to credit with contemporary building conditions. According to the, if you consider areas in the HOLC report that were marked hazardous, you can see these are areas where folks often had to defer maintenance on building stock, as well as the impact of the loss of generational wealth afforded by property ownership that was caused by the extraction of capital from these neighborhoods in the decades prior. Deferred maintenance on South and West Side building stock, as well as the loss of generational wealth afforded by property ownership, was caused by contract buying and selling, and also by redlining. If you all haven't read the book Family Properties by Beryl Satter that focuses on this topic, especially in North Lawndale, I highly recommended it. Satter argues that due to contract selling schemes, quote, the greatest injuries were borne by ordinary Chicagoans, especially ordinary Black Chicagoans, the janitors, mechanics, steel workers, clerks, laundry workers, and domestics whose dreams of owning a family property so often turned sour. In today's South and West Sides, these costs continue to be visible because homeowners in redline zones lack the financial resources needed, resources that white Chicagoans amassed through home equity and rising property value across generations to repair and maintain buildings, and the conditions for tenants often remains the same. Despite the fact that redlining and contract buying and selling was banned at the federal level, in part due to community organizing that happened out of Chicago and North Lawndale, as we know, predatory lending continues because racism is good business. I've been kind of working collaboratively with a group of attorneys who represent victims of a reverse mortgage scam. In 2017, scam artist Mark Diamond was charged with defrauding West Side homeowners, mostly elderly African-American women, out of over $10 million. Diamond asked his victims to sign reverse mortgages, telling them that they were signing up for a non-existent city-sponsored home repair program. And I've heard from folks who were victims of this fraud that many of them were lured by the kind of complete package that Diamond offered. He offered them funding, design services, contractors, and the ability to clear violations. So you could say, in a kind of evil sort of way, this fraudster came up with the first idea of the Office of the Public Architect. You may be asking, what is the role of architects in all of this and where are they now? I think that it's worth noting that even the earliest Chicago building code on record, printed in 1905, the Practice Act is cited in the requirement that a licensed architect author plans for any construction of work to be permitted. This professional monopolization of the oversight of health, safety, and welfare in the built environment profession not only catalyzes the need for a public architect, design services for those who cannot afford them, but also poses questions about how the public architect might avoid reproducing the conditions that led to its need. This is a map that I made with data from the AIA as well as Illinois, as well as in Chicago. So the base map shows a heat map of building violations. The small dots show the registered addresses of licensed architects, individuals, and the large dots represent registered design firms, which is the state-wide registration that you have to practice architecture as a business. So as you can see from this map, everywhere that we are needed, we are not. I do want to point out that changes in the building code, which I believe could be a way of framing the intervention of the Office of the Public Architect, has always been subject to activism and kind of progressive movements. So rather than thinking of the building code and the regulations around it, including the requirements to have a licensed architect sign and stamp plans, we could think of this as a kind of discursive document for change. For example, in the earliest 20th century, advocacy and reform movements led first by the Hull House founder and head resident Jane Addams, followed by the City Homes Association, and then by activists, educators, and scholars Edith Abbott and Sophonisba Breckinridge. Contemporaries of Clara Shortridge Fultz led to more stringent requirements for access to light, air, ventilation, and plumbing based on studies of tenement conditions in Chicago. Decades later, in the 1970s, activism around disability rights led to many new provisions for accessibility. A guide to architectural standards titled Accessibility Standards, which you see here, was published in 1978 by the Illinois Capital Development Board, 12 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act. The guide was the product of disability rights activism in Illinois, including by architect Jack Catlin, who uses a wheelchair and worked with officials to draft the standards, as well as the broader efforts of artists with disabilities in an organization called Access Living. So just to come back to Clara Fultz, how can the Office of the Public Architect help us to rethink ways to collectively produce a safe and ethical city? As the primary form of legal defense in the United States, despite its chronic underfunding, today the institution of the public defender seems obvious. Initially, however, many scorned the idea of the public defender. In 1897, the New York Times called it, quote unquote, absurd, and the strange project of a female attorney. Other people believed that it would lead to a flood of criminal behavior.
Everyone, we are just having some technical difficulties. I think we will resolve shortly. We lost the stream, but really interesting presentation so far. Be sure to put your questions in the YouTube chat so we can, ask them when it's question asking time. I know I have some questions, so bring the questions on. And okay, oh, looks like we are back.
I'm so sorry. Okay, critical moment for my computer to decide to fail. Give me 1 second.
Partial with this Zoom stuff.
I know, you'd think after so long we would be able to, it would work flawlessly. Okay, are you able to see my screen now?
We are.
Okay, I'm just going to backtrack quickly that the New York Times called the idea of the Office of a Public Defender absurd. But I wanted to just flag that Foltz's proposal was initially supported by other women lawyers whose advocacy for the public defender had emerged from their joint experiences in serving quote unquote poor, sick, and despairing clients, many of whom hired women lawyers because their rates were lower than their male colleagues, as well as for their work on progressive causes like women's suffrage and prison reform. And I note this partially to say that Clara Foltz did not do this advocacy by herself, but instead worked with others to advocate for this idea, and the kind of banner was taken up by many others. And though the Office of the Public Defender was not implemented federally until decades after she passed away, I see my advocacy for the Office of the Public Architect as in the same way as something that I hope that other people will take up and carry forward. Inspired by the work of Clara Shortridge Foltz's vision for a more equitable legal system, the work of the Office of the Public Architect represents the need for these expanded modes of practice, if only in service of a more balanced enforcement of the building codes. By acting as a shield, the public architect has the potential to affect change at the scale of the parapet detail to the site of the collective city. So quickly, and I know I'm running a little bit over, but I just wanted to show this slide that I put together. And I just wanted to flag that there are right now, under different Chicago departments, a range of different resources that our Office of the Public Architect like. So currently in the Department of Buildings, there's a single family homeowners assistance program that if you meet a variety of kind of requirements, the DOB can provide some limited architectural services to support you. Additionally, in the Department of Housing, for example, there's an emergency roof, porch, and heating repair program that folks apply for in a lottery, as well as a range of other kind of small grants and services that are spread out over different departments. I also included here in gray in the bottom left, two programs that are for small business owners, also who deal with building violations. Just to think about, in the course of my research, I also found that many sociologists are working on the topic that kind of increased red tape can be also a kind of undue burden to minority-owned businesses, and building violations is one of them. So I kind of wanted to ask with this slide, if you were to ask me how to start the Office of the Public Architect tomorrow in Chicago, I would say that I believe that there is some kind of pilot program that could bring together these existing resources while giving them teeth and funding. And then also bringing to them the question of design. And I'd be curious to hear from you all whether this seems like a good idea to you, and those of you who know how to navigate policy and government, if there's some feedback you could give on this idea. But lastly, I want to do a very quick story time with us. And it'll just be a kind of brief time travel into a future Office of the Public Architect, and you get to look at this swirling GIF inspired by Harry Potter while I read to you. What is the Office of the Public Architect? Where is it located? Is it in Lynn City Hall, buried in the labyrinth of offices inside the Department of Buildings? What does it smell like? Are the desks made of laminate, wood, or steel? Are they holographic? Is it distributed through the city, like a library or post office close to your home, where you can visit at your convenience? Is it on a truck that travels to your door? Does the public architect smile? Imagine yourself in a near or distant future when the Office of the Public Architect is funded and appointed in the same way as the city's building inspectors. Stop, correct that. Both are well-funded and both are thriving, but the Office of the Public Architect is the center for all things civic in the built environment. As a model of practice, it skips over the well-worn tropes of the 21st century sole practitioner who minimizes overhead and fulfills your code requirements with the necessary speed and leanness. Instead, it leverages scale and the tactics of socially engaged and activist practices in order to work nimbly and horizontally. It becomes a network, a hive, a coalition, an office in the public interest. Consider meeting a public architect. They help you resolve your building violations. Some are easy, some are still a pain. You sit adjacent to each other at a large table with pens and drawings. If you've been issued many building violations, they help you create a plan to address them over time in accordance with your budget. They don't require you, as they did in 2021, to address them all at once. You collaborate to do a form of triage. The lights are warm and they glow. In the waiting room, you meet some of your neighbors, you chat about your week. Some of them attended events at the Office of the Public Architect a few days before. They met with general contractors, material reps, tradesmen, all of whom had been vetted by the city. Someone found a plumber who seemed okay. They give you the plumber's business card. There's a schedule on the wall that seems almost overfull, workshops on design and construction, lectures and events by local groups, an opportunity to sign out the space for a program of your own devising. Maybe you find out that some of your repairs can be addressed through an easy permit without an architect's stamp. You get help filing the application and make plans to start work. You pull additional information on other permits for the built environment available from the Department of Transportation, which can issue you a permit for a sidewalk cafe, planter boxes, signage hanging over the road. A large digital map floats above you, glowing a rich blue for Lake Michigan. Little LED lights flicker on and off, showing the resolution of building violations and the issuance of new ones. Red circles blink slowly over buildings owned by the city's, quote, problem building owners. A weather forecast radar washes over the screen, producing signals for sites of possible storm sewer overflow. Small peaks indicate aldermanic contributions by ward to infrastructure spending. What happens behind the desk? Architects buzz about, they argue with each other. A junior architect has forgotten to reference the most up-to-date stock detail for parapet repair, which was revised last month to adhere to more efficient masonry standards. The other young designers, many recent graduates, join the ranks of the public architect for on-the-ground experience, the desire to serve, or simply the reputation of the office for quickly producing licensed architects, remind her of the update and send around a meme about bricks in the group chat. Everyone cackles. One senior architect puts on her coat to head to the building court to testify about a predatory landlord in a porch collapse. The back of house at the office looks like a chaotic mess with some kind of underlying organization only known to those who work there: maps, data analysis, material samples, mock-ups, flyers, and tax records. The architects always expect to work at the scale of the city. Their guidelines on insulation, for example, gave them leverage with insulation manufacturers. The impacts on energy use were visible across the city in just 1 year. They work with the city's departments, keeping conversations open with water management, transportation, the mayor's office for people with disabilities. They open new partnerships with activists, organizers, schools, and community groups. Later in the day, a big developer who wants to build on a series of vacant lots in your neighborhood will present their plans in a forum at the office. A public architect will moderate. You plan to attend. The alderman seeks feedback. Dinner from the neighborhood pizza place you hear will be served. Before closing up for the day, an architect checks the big countdown clock that notes how many violations are currently active. After a long period of battling down the backlog of hundreds of thousands, these days they watch it flicker up and down in the low hundreds. When the clock reaches zero, which happens a few days every year, an annoyingly loud buzzer goes off and everybody celebrates. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we will move on to the questions. You all ready to go? Okay. So first question is, how is the market value of the home determined to see if it will go into receivership?
That is a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. Yes, I don't know the answer to that. I know that that is one of the conditions in which a home can go into receivership, but I don't know if it's through, like if the city brings out its own assessor or through a different kind of formula. I know you all also, there's been a lot of kind of conversation about assessment and equity in assessment. So I think that is a good question about whether that's another space where discrimination may have kind of undue impact on what often eventually becomes demolition and vacancy. If other folks know, I guess I'd be curious to know the answer, and I think they should throw it in the chat.
I can ask the next question. So after the Surfside condo collapse, isn't code enforcement more urgent? What is being done to make sure that buildings in Chicago continue to be safe and required maintenance is being done?
Yeah, I think that collapse is on the mind of every architect and engineer. I think after that happened, I mean, nobody in my discipline, like we didn't start one conversation during those weeks without kind of thinking and talking about it, because it's really, it's like it's truly horrifying, which is something that doesn't need to be said. Right now, the kind of a lot of the inspections that I mentioned are done by an arm of building inspectors called the Conservation Bureau, and they move throughout the city of Chicago, issuing violations on building exteriors, but they can also, through that process, request a kind of interior inspection. So that process is the kind of primary process that's used to make sure that buildings are continuing to conform to building code. You can also call in building violations. So if you look in the publicly available data on violations, many of them are triggered by 311 calls. So you can call in if you are a tenant on a building that you live in, or you can call in about a building that you see in the street. I do believe, for me, that this is one of the reasons why an Office of the Public Architect would be a really valuable resource. I think that there is a lot of deferred maintenance, partially just because homeowners or building owners don't necessarily have the expertise to assess their own buildings, which is correct. Like, really, we should have licensed architects and structural engineers be evaluating the kind of state of the condition of buildings. But often many people cannot afford to hire professional services. And I think that causes people often to defer maintenance, or to try to find kind of ways of addressing building issues in a way that could be more thorough. The case of in Miami, which is a condo building, and it seems like there are kind of broader issues about deferred maintenance for buildings that were built during that time, that I think we're going to be seeing like a whole range of buildings built at that era, especially ones that are also being impacted by climate change. That's a little bit different than I think the folks who I imagine being served by the Office of the Public Architect, but it's kind of a shared issue, which is that if we really believe that everybody in the city deserves to live in a kind of safe and humane built environment, we shouldn't be addressing problems after they happen. We should be addressing problems in advance, which are, honestly, from a design point of view, it's always easier to solve problems before they get worse, rather than when they become very extreme.
Next question, is anyone creating a library with links to all these articles about housing discrimination, etc.? I point to some articles about redlining from my web library, but it's only a small sample.
Yeah, from the academic side, I know that there's an incredible syllabus that was created by many architectural historians and designers that is focused on issues of discrimination, but actually about race and space kind of broadly. It's called Space/Race. If you Google around for it, it's very easy to find. I will also pull the link and send it to the organizers who can send it around. There's a whole section on housing that is really valuable, mostly scholarly articles, but it's also crowdsourced. So if you yourself find additional articles that you think are important and relevant, you can also send them in. And I know it's a resource that has been used a lot by scholars who are working on this topic in different fields.
What's the typical timeline for how a homeowner experiences all this?
It's a good question. In the case of the folks I've met who were victims of the fraudster, reverse mortgage fraud, who were in the kind of most dire of circumstances, I think that the timeline is really, really long. So people are living for a long time with deferred maintenance, because often I think when you are in conditions of scarcity, for example, like tuck pointing your parapet may not be the most urgent thing when food needs to be put on the table or there are healthcare needs that need to be addressed, things like that. So they're dealing with the kind of issues over a very long timeline. And then design and construction itself also takes a lot of time, and both the kind of design process and construction, as well as the kind of city's inspection and review process and housing court and everything. So to me, the urgency of the Office of the Public Architect is a kind of civic scale urgency that we as a city need to kind of decide that if we are going to tell residents that they need to address building violations, we also need to provide the resources to do so for folks who can't afford to. That to me is a kind of civic scale urgency. I think and certainly like in the case of some buildings, yes, there are kind of like immediately hazardous issues that the city will come out and address immediately. But I think, yeah, the timeline is slow, and folks who are homeowners kind of probably can also empathize with that even once you realize you need to get your plumbing fixed, it might take another 3 months for you to get around to calling a plumber, and another 3 months for that plumber to get you a bid, or tell you that you need to hire an architect to get you a permit, and so on. And so to me, I think we have to kind of balance the long timeline of buildings with the kind of urgent timeline of equity in the city. And those are two things I try to kind of keep in mind at the same time.
What does it take on the part of policymakers to get this done? Is there an opportunity for this to be part of the conversation with infrastructure policy in the works?
Yeah, I don't know. And that is something that I'm hoping to kind of kick back to you all. I'm trained as an architect and as a designer. If you are an individual homeowner and you hire me to help you resolve your building violations, I'm very confident I could do this. How to have this implemented at a policy scale is something that is really beyond my knowledge. One of the things that was very inspiring to me about reading about Clara Foltz was that a lot of the women that she worked with who were advocating for the public defender were also suffragists. So they were in the habit of writing bills and proposing them and trying to get them turned into law. So they had this kind of rhythm to the work that they were already doing through suffrage that they kind of translated into some of the advocacy work that they were doing for the public defender's office. But they also happened to be lawyers advocating for law. And I think one thing that I am thinking about and don't know how to bridge is how can we use design thinking to advocate for policy change? I mean, that's something that I'm hoping that I can get feedback from everyone here about.
Is this a problem in all cities, or is there some set of circumstances that make this a larger problem in Chicago?
This is also a question that I don't know the specific answer to. Like, is this more severe here than in other cities? I'm teaching a course in the fall where I'm hoping to compare 5 major cities across the US and their histories with building code and current violations. So New York, Houston, LA, Chicago, and Detroit, which I think run an interesting gamut of their relationship to code. And I am curious to know the answer to that too, whether there is some sort of I suspect that in Chicago, there is some sort of confluence of discriminatory housing practices plus a very unique building code, which Chicago was the last major city in the US to conform to the international building code, plus the kind of ongoing impacts of segregation, I think also create a really inequitable environment for design services. The map, which I kind of intuitively thought would look like that, still surprised me the moment it popped up on GIS. So I'm sure it's something you guys all have the experience with, that when you see it, that architects are literally just not located on the south and west sides with a very few exceptions. It seems to me that the confluence of those three things has kind of produced the unique situation we're in, but I am not sure, and I'm curious to find out. So I guess I'll say I will also hope to report back in kind of future research after this fall.
Is there any connection between people who land on the city's problem landlord list and people who may lack resources to remedy building violations?
I also don't know the answer to this question. There's a really great sociologist, Robin Bartram, who's based out of Tulane, who has done really intensive work on the Department of Buildings and specifically building inspectors. She interned, or she worked at the Department of Buildings for 6 months and rode around with building inspectors so she could understand the kind of sociology of how they engage the city. And one of the things that she noticed with building inspectors is that they perceive themselves to be in a war or kind of on the side of the little guy versus the big guy. So if they were inspecting a house that was by owner occupied, they would try to go easy on the little guy, while when they went to a building that was an apartment building owned by a landlord, if there were issues, they would go harder on the landlord. However, one of the things that Robin noted in her work on this was that a lot of the costs of building violations ended up just getting deflected onto tenants anyway. So it wasn't like landlords were doing repairs. They would either be evicting tenants to do it, or they would just deflect the costs into increased rents. So that was one observation she made that I found to be very interesting. But I think that in that study, there has been yet to be that level of cross-referencing, whether the landlords that were being kind of aggressively targeted by building inspectors were themselves also from conditions of scarcity where lack of resources might be an issue. So it is a good question, but I think for me, the thing is that is clearly the issue of kind of class difference is something that is impacting how building inspectors work in the city, because they are also humans and also live in a social cultural environment and also have an opinion about the work they do, and they have some discretion in when they choose to see when a crack becomes a crack, so I think that that's definitely something that should be looked at closer, because it's part of the landscape of how these building violations happen and accrue.
How much do various building violations cost to fix, and what kinds of funds exist to help fund repairs for people who may not have the resources?
Yeah, they run the gamut. Small building violations can just be a few $100s. If you have some major issue, it's not even really the fee that is the issue. The issue is the hard cost of construction and repair. There are some resources. So Department of Housing has a few resources for owner-occupied homes. If you're a senior citizen, there are some accessibility repairs that you can have done for free. You can also have your building permit fees waived if you are a senior citizen in a home that you've occupied for more than 10 years. And then Neighborhood Housing Services also has a series of both low interest loans as well as grants targeted to homeowners that I am not sure if they are going this year during COVID, but I think are a resource that I have heard people talk about. One thing that's interesting to me is Robin Bartram, the sociologist, she's been doing some work on looking at these small kind of grants from the DOH. And what she found was when she talked to elderly homeowners, many of whom are women, especially on the south and west sides, that there was kind of a whisper network of resources, that women would kind of talk to each other and say, hey, here are these grants that are available. Here's how you navigate them. Here's who you can call. Here's how you kind of can get something out of this. But that says to me that there's actually like a lot of knowledge that that you have to have in order to kind of navigate those resources. And for me, that's one of the issues of that I hope the Office of the Public Architect could address, that you could like go to somewhere in your neighborhood and there could be a friendly person who like knows how to do it, who could help you. You wouldn't have to rely on this, though there's like value, I think, to the kind of horizontal knowledge building, that there could be somebody who could just like help you without everybody having to spend their kind of personal time in trying to understand how to navigate bureaucracy.
Okay, briefly, we have one last question. Well, was there a difference between small landlords and larger landlords?
In terms of accrual of building violations, I also don't know, but I do think that is a map that could be made quite quickly, because I think we could look at unit count versus violations on an address. But I think what the thing is that I don't know is, if just because buildings are bigger, does that mean that landlords are bigger? One thing that was very interesting to me in Beryl Satter's text, Family Properties, where she, her father had been a kind of building owner in North Lawndale, when North Lawndale was still predominantly Jewish. And she kind of wrote about some of the struggles that were faced by landlords who are like kind of a medium scale. So that is something that I am curious to know. I think what Miami shows us is that even large buildings are subject to deferred maintenance. Even large buildings with resources are subject to deferred maintenance, that can have really, really dangerous and kind of problematic outcomes.
That, I think we are going to wrap up. Thank you so much for presenting a really interesting, really innovative idea.
Thank you for these amazing questions, most of which I did not know the answer to, but they were really thought-provoking. I'm going to, I'll send out the Space Race syllabus, which I think is a good resource, but I hope folks will get in touch too if they have any ideas or additional questions or want to find some opportunity to collaborate.
So I guess we have the slide with the Zoom link for post presentation. So there's a post presentation and we have intros, announcements, fun socializing, breakout pitches. So just go to that Zoom link and the code of conduct does still apply. And what else? Oh, yeah. Okay, and tonight's broadcast will be posted in the coming days on our YouTube channel. So I think it's time for a time-honored tradition. It's stay safe, take care, and
Go
forth and hack. See you, everybody.
All right, bye.